Welcome to the Work in Progress podcast. This is a space where we want to create conversations around things that actually matter. Thanks for joining us today. We hope these words encourage you to know that no matter where we are in our journeys, we're all still a work in progress.
Welcome back to our podcast. If you can hear the crickets in the background, we just realized that there are crickets in here, so hopefully you can't hear them. Hey, we are back for another episode. This is Work in Progress podcast. My name is Daniel, joined by my friend Aaron here. And man, this is a big episode because this is actually episode number 10.
Let's go.
Let's do it. We've done 10 episodes. We haven't been banned or cut off or you name it. We haven't had it. We're still going. We're 10 episodes in. So thank you guys for joining us on this journey.
Yeah, thanks.
We are still work in progress.
Yeah,
obviously
we're working on it.
Man, today we are talking about something that we actually read in a book we read. And so, hey, a couple weeks back, we talked about this book called Welcoming the Future Church by Jonathan Pokluda. Incredible read, great book. If you are ever interested in reading about the next generation and church and how do those two things come together, this is a book I'd recommend. I guess we can link it into the show notes as well.
We'll link that.
But there is one part of this book that we're going to talk about today, and it's the reasons why the next generation doesn't go to church. So to give you a little background here, I work at a church, right? And so this is something that I read, and it's something that I begin to think through of like, man, how do we take these things and make them not points of weakness, but actual points of strength. And so this conversation that we're going to have today is going to kind of be a little bit of a back and forth as we talk through some of the topics that are in the book. I just want to say off the top, these are not all the reasons why people say they don't go to church. These are just some of the more common that we read in the book and that we've experienced in our own life or in conversations with people. And so, all right, I think you want to just dive in?
Yeah, man,
good?
That's well said. Yeah. And so, preface on my end. So I'm going to be giving responses that are me, that I thought through these lenses of when I was actively and consistently not going to church. And so
that's good.
Prepping for this episode, I was thinking back and reflecting on those times. And so, one of the first points that we read was, church is not important. And so thinking back on that, putting myself in those shoes of the person who did that, right? I didn't go to church. And I thought that was true, but also false because I knew that church was important. I knew that it was important. I had always grown growing up. I'd always gone growing up. And I felt strongly that I knew it was the right thing and that I should have been doing. And I think the reason that I didn't go was because I didn't know why it was important.
That's good.
And I think there's a big distinction there. You know, like at the time it was throughout my college career. And so there's so many other things that felt like they were more important than going to church. Right. So for example, like I felt my grades were more important than church. I felt that my friendships were more important than church. I felt that, to be honest, basketball, I was in the rec playing basketball most of the days of the week. And I felt like that was more important than going to church. And I think the reason why I thought that and felt that was because those are the relationships that I had been nurturing, that I had been trying to foster and trying to grow intentionally, right? Like I didn't have many friends, so I made an effort to find friends and I nurtured those relationships and kept them all through college, you know? Same with basketball. I had done that my whole life. I'd done school my whole life. And so I was like, okay, these are the things that I know and these are the things that I'm comfortable with. And so I'm going to continue to foster and care for those relationships that I'd already established. And that wasn't something that I had done at church. Yeah. And so I think just off the top, that's why that I didn't think church was important. And although I knew it was important, you know what I mean?
Yeah. And so I think even in that, like it is a great place to start. You're not alone in that thought, especially when you leave college. Statistics show that, you know, of the people that don't go to church, almost a third say they don't go to church because they just don't think it's important, right? And so we begin to have this, like, that's a big chunk. Like that's a lot. You know, statistics wise, that's a big chunk of a group that has one of the same reason. And so as I begin to read through this book and like I'm thinking of this stuff, I think off the top, we need to be praying for this next generation. Like there's nothing that we're gonna do, like ourselves, that makes church important to them? Like we need to begin to pray that their hearts get softened, that they come to a place in their life where they have no other option, like where they have no other thing to rely on. And so I think that's where you start. I think we just need to be praying for them. One thing that we pray often, especially for our students, for those of you that don't know, I'm a student pastor. And so we pray that the students that we have, especially in high school and as they get toward the end of their high school career, that when they leave, church doesn't stay here. Like we want them to be in love with God, in love with Jesus, not just necessarily our church, so much that when they leave and they go off to college or they go into the workforce, that there's an empty piece whenever they don't have church. And so they go get plugged in somewhere else. Because it's Jesus who we want them to fall in love with. And where do you learn more about Jesus? Where do you connect people who love Jesus? At church. And so it becomes vital for them. But honestly, as I think through this, not that I give a pass to this next generation, but it's almost, I look at the generation before, my generation before mine, and we made church optional. Like we made church not a priority. We made church not important. And so with that being said, it's no wonder that they don't find church important. Like we were the ones that said, oh, you know what, this week, family rest day is more important than going to church, or, hey, sporting event is more important than going to church, or, hey, whatever, you fill in the blank, was more important than going to church, where we made it to where church just wasn't important. Like anything else that came up over that passed over that. Now, I say that coming from a family that even when we went on vacation, we would find a church to go to on Sunday. And so like I'm blessed that my parents didn't make it that way. That church was always important. And I think I've benefited a lot from that. But even in the moments when I was in college that I felt like sleeping in, those Sundays that I missed, like I'd feel like, oh, there's an emptiness there. And so part of it is like the tradition, part of it is the routine. But part of it was that the generation before us, my generation before us, we made it almost optional. And so of course the people that leave, they're like, oh, it's just like everything else. Like it was always optional and it still is optional. And so I think that's one of the first things that we have to look at. And I think recognizing that gives us the momentum to change the narrative. Like it doesn't always have to be that way, but we need to start by making church important again. And so number one, church is not important. I hope that the more you dive into your faith, the more you dive into your relationship with Christ, you realize that no, church is important.
Absolutely.
That actually kind of leads us into the second one. The second thing that they talked about was that, hey, you can connect with God anywhere. That's an excuse. I don't need to go to church on Sundays because, hey, I can connect with God anywhere. Tell me, what do you think?
Dude, so that's a big one. And I think it's true. I mean, if we're being honest, it's true, right? Like you can connect with God anywhere. You can study anywhere. You can work anywhere. But when you're not in the environment that's filled with that, when you're not in the community of people specifically designed for that, it makes it a whole lot harder to do, right?
Sure.
And so, so thinking back on my life, I think it's like an excuse, right? It's like one of those, my viewpoint is like, it's almost like a lazy excuse, like you're giving yourself an out, right? And, I think I'm reflecting on my college days once again. And so I'm thinking like, okay, I probably could have learned calculus at home, but there's no way I would have passed it. You know what I mean? Like when you surround yourself in the environment of a school, of a classroom with people all trying to aim at the same goal, passing calculus, passing chemistry, whatever the grade or whatever the class is, there's a common goal. You're connected with people who you can relate to because they're going through the same struggles.
Yeah, that's good.
And they're going through the same like highs and lows as you. And so I think just as important as it is to be in like a classroom with people who are similar and going through the same thing, it's the same with church, right? You can connect with God anywhere. You can learn calculus anywhere, but it's going to be harder to do it without those people who are in your corner, who have maybe even gone through the experiences that you've gone through or are going through. You know?
I've literally had this conversation with people. Matter of fact, not too long ago, I was talking to one of my neighbors and, we started talking about church and things like that. And I asked him, I said, hey man, do you guys go to church anywhere? He's a 20-something-year-old with a wife and a couple kids, and I'm like, man, he's talking about, I grew up in church, I did church, and I was like, hey, where do you guys go now? And he's like, I have found that I can connect with God anywhere. Like literally the words out of his mouth where I can connect with God anywhere. I just don't really think that I need to go to church to make that happen. And so the first thing I said was, you're right, you can connect with God anywhere. And he kind of like looked at me, because he knows that I work at a church. And then I went on to tell him like this story that I've heard. So God is everywhere, right? Obviously, he's everywhere and you can connect with him anywhere. But then I asked him like, how many times on a Sunday morning at say 10 o'clock have you actually set aside time to connect with God?
Right.
And he was like, I don't know, 9 a.m., 11 a.m., Saturday at 11 p.m. Like, what have you actually set aside time to connect with God? Most of us would say, well, no, like I didn't set aside an hour and a half to actually connect and worship and pray and read scripture and have somebody teach me. Okay. And even if you did, even if you are somebody who's setting aside time, I shared this story with him. Old school evangelist D.L. Moody tells this story about a lonely ember, right? And so he's making a house visit to somebody in their church that hadn't been there in a while. And it is a cold, I think Chicago is where he was from, cold Chicago night. And so he goes to this guy's house and he walks in and, they have the conversation and he began to talk to this guy who hadn't been in church, and he kind of gives him the same answer of like, I can connect with God anywhere. Okay. So he walks over to the fireplace and he kicks one of the embers out, right? The ember is glowing, it's red, and it's laying there. After a few seconds, once it's been removed from the fire, what happens to the ember? Like it dies out. Mm-hmm. It goes, dark black, it's no longer a glowing ember, right? And he's making a point to say like, hey, like, yeah, you can experience God everywhere, but how much more will your faith continue to grow? How much more will you have support? How much more substantial will your walk with Christ be when you're actually in a community, like you said, of people who are on fire together, right? We learn and we grow in community, and that happens at church.
Yeah.
Right? That happens there. And so when you're separated from that church, when you're separated from those community, when you're separated from those people, what happens? You end up dying out. Mm-hmm. Right? There's a parable in scripture that Jesus talks about, like the weeds and throwing seeds on the ground, and it gets choked up by the weeds. It gets picked up by the birds of the air. Right? It's the same thing. Like, right? Being in community at church is where life change continues to happen. It's where growth happens. It's where you are now connected with people who are chasing after the same things you are. And so, needless to say, at the end of that conversation with D.L. Moody, the guy's like, hey, I'll see you at church on Sunday. And so that's just one of those things, man. You can connect with God anywhere, no doubt. Some of the most intense experiences I've had with God have been in nature. Like, right, going to see the Grand Canyon was one of those where it's like, like you can tell like God's handiwork is here, right? Doesn't mean that I stopped going to church on Sundays because I still need that community. So that's really good, man.
And one thing I also think about it, like, because I've been in that position, right? And there's a huge difference between holding yourself accountable and then having others like-minded holding you accountable. And I think that if we rely on our own strength in that, first of all, it's a little like, can come off as a little arrogant, like I could do it on my own. I don't need others. And then second, it's like, we're so broken and flawed, and it's going to fail eventually, you know? So it's like, there's only so much you can do on your own, but together,
on your own, you will burn out.
Yeah.
You will be that ember that goes out.
Yeah. What's the saying? If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together.
Oh, that's good. I don't know if I've actually heard that one, or it's been a while. That's
really
good. That's really
dude.
Good. Hey, the next one that's in this book is one that just says, you know what? Church is too boring.
Yeah.
Too boring. Okay, go for it. Tell me what you think.
Dude, yes. This was an interesting one because I was like, man, church is kind of boring, But putting myself in those shoes, comparing myself to now, I'm like, yeah, church was boring at that time because I was trying to go with the flow of life, of culture, right? I was trying to fit in with my friends. I was trying to be one of the cool guys on the basketball court. And I was trying to go with that flow. And so when you think about church, you think about the gospel, you think about Jesus, it's so countercultural that how can something so countercultural and so life-giving be boring, you know? And so my lens was distorted because I was trying to go with what was already happening in culture and not trying to make a change and go against the grain by following Jesus. And so I think I did that in a couple of areas in my life. Like I was, like, to be honest, like I was one of the guys that didn't really party, didn't really drink. Occasionally I'd have like one beverage, and this was all above the age of 21. I'm not even just saying that. That's just the kind of guy I was. Like I held strong in that, and people would notice that, and they're like, "Dude, you're at a party. What are you doing? You're not drinking?" And I'm like, "Nah, I got to drive home, man. Like, how am I supposed to, you know?" And so in ways that I showed the countercultural, against the grain-ness, you could say, people noticed, and it stood out, and it was never boring. I was never just, I don't know. So that's kind of what I think of when I think of this. Yeah, I mean, my life outside of church, which I didn't go to church very often, but was literally just school, working out, and sleeping. And if you ask me, that's pretty boring. And my walk with Christ so far has been far from boring, because it's been filled with like so many positive and just roller coaster of events. So
yeah,
it's interesting, man. It's interesting how you reflect back on those times, and like I see all these points, and I'm like, dude, yeah, I thought that I actually lived in these points of not going to church because of these reasons. And now thinking back, I'm like, dude, that's crazy, because it's so far from the truth.
The crazy thing, like, I'm glad you said that, like, boring is almost like an excuse, right? Like, it's just something that, like, it's boring, right? It's like what the kid says, right? When they don't want to do something, they're like, oh, it's too boring. You know, I used to teach math in my previous world, and that was the kids, right? The kids who didn't get it, the kids who struggled, the kids who just didn't want to do math. They'd be like, oh, it's so boring, right? That was just their go-to, right? I think we do the same thing. Like, it's boring because we don't want to put ourselves out there. Like, we don't want to be vulnerable. We don't want to actually have change. We don't want to get in community. We don't want to do those things. It's boring, right? But you're right. I think, honestly, like, I was the same way up to a few years ago. Like, we did the church, my wife and I did the church thing, and we were kind of bored with it. Like, we would just go to Sundays, you go to service, hear the music, hear the message, go home, sweet. That was the end of that. Kept going with our life. That is kind of boring. Like, it just becomes a habit or a tradition that is boring. But then, like, something switched, and we're like, you know what? We don't want to be just the boring, typical American couple going to church on Sunday because it's tradition. We actually want to press in and find out what God has for us in our life. And so we begin to open up and get vulnerable and pray big prayers and seek guidance and connect with people in our church. And it's led us down this road over the past 4 years that has been anything but boring, anything but. And if you know our story a little bit, moving several times, changing careers, moving to new cities, like, it's been anything but boring. Yeah. And that's because we've been chasing after Christ. And so, matter of fact, not been boring, but it's been uncomfortable basically the entire 4 years, and it's always changing. But that's fun. I look back now at the last 4 years, and I'm like, man, I'm so glad I didn't settle for just a boring, typical life. And so I think maybe if that's your excuse of, oh, it's boring, maybe if your church is boring, maybe I would challenge you don't be boring. Yeah. How about that? And so if you think, oh, it's boring, why don't you pray and ask God for just something fresh? Yeah. And maybe that fresh piece is you. And so if it's boring, man, pray for a fire to come down or something, because it's not a boring life to walk with Christ. And
I agree, man. And I think what's boring is a schedule or a routine that doesn't change, right? What's boring is walking in that comfortability of knowing exactly what you're going to do, when you're going to do it. And with Christ, it's like, dude, he could put something on your heart that changes all that in a second. Just like these guys, they literally bought a home, and they didn't even live in it because they were being called to minister to apartments. And so they lived in an apartment while they owned a house, which is pretty nuts, you know,
it's still crazy to think about.
It's crazy. You guys owned your first home ever as a married couple, as people, your first home. You didn't even live in it because you were feeling that pull from God to go minister to people who were, didn't have that in their community at their apartment. So that's super admirable, man. And really cool that you did that. And so it doesn't sound boring to me. It sounds kind of insane, to be honest.
And it's been the best thing ever. I mean, we've met so many cool people, had so many great conversations. that whole journey led us to here. And so like,
Yeah.
I mean, doing this, and so not boring at all. Man, the last thing that we wanted to highlight in this book was, oh, well, I don't go to church because it's not relevant. It's
Yeah.
out of date. It's out of touch with what's going on. Yeah, go ahead. Take that one.
Yeah, this was a tough one for me to answer because, like, not necessarily the reason I didn't go to church, but thinking about it, I'm like, okay, yeah, I, grew up with a Catholic background, and so it is very much full of tradition and reverence, and so a lot of the culture within the Catholic Church is kind of older. It's not super up to date. It's not super modern. It's not the most fun place to be. Because it's very traditional, very the same, And it's not a negative thing. It's just what it is. It's what it is, and it's what it's always been. And so I was thinking through that lens, and like, I was thinking about our church, and I've heard this been said a couple times here at Awaken Church, and it's like, if you feel as if there's a piece or like a ministry piece that's missing, or you feel as if there's something that could be changed or corrected, take the step and do it yourself, like be the change that you want to see for the next generation. And so I was thinking, that came to my mind whenever I was processing this, because I probably could have done that at that church. I probably could have been more involved in like the young adults groups that there were. And I don't know if they were up to date. I don't know if they were, relevant or not, because I didn't go.
Yeah.
And so that was like the first thing. But one of the things I could have done, if I could have started it. I could have started a young adults group, make it a fresh wind of an experience to the people who are going to carry that through the generations. And so, I think that's one of the things that I missed when I didn't go to church. I didn't know if it was relevant or not, but also I wasn't the person to make the change to happen.
Yeah. And like, let's be honest, right? Like, we're on a podcast, to be honest, right? There are some churches out there that are probably a little bit out of touch and a little bit out of date.
Right.
And because they stick to very heavy traditions. But
Yeah.
in the same way that one church may do something different than the next church, right? Like, we all go to chain restaurants, right? And if one of those chain restaurants is not as good as the one that you're used to, you don't like just stop and you never go back. Like, right, if I go to a Whataburger one time and they mess up my order and it's not as good as the Whataburgers that I'm used to, it doesn't mean I stop going to Whataburger.
True.
Like, I just try another chain, right? Because they're all, it's a burger, right? And it's something that I enjoy. And so if one person is not, or if one establishment is not as good as the other ones, then I go try. And so I would say that off the top, like, if you've had this experience where you've gone to a church and you've actually tried it and you've stayed there for a while and you feel like it's not relevant or out of date, try another one. I think you don't want to just stay at one and then that's it.
Yeah. What you said, throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, man. And that's not say like just church hop and just like crazy, like find a place to be connected.
Yeah.
But if you've been in a place for a while and you're like, oh, this is not, and you've tried to start new things, or you've tried to, like what Aaron was just talking about, man, go find some place that's doing it, because there are churches that are doing it and doing it well. I think right now more than ever across our country, there's just this awakening of young adults, college students, young adults that are on fire for Christ, and that churches are saying, come on, like, we need you. Come be a part of what we're doing. And I think there's churches now more than ever that are looking at their traditions and like seeing like, is this really gospel aligned, or is this just a human tradition? And if it's not gospel aligned, then we can change. And so I would just say, as an encouragement to young adults, next generation, like, we need you. Like, the church needs you. You are the ones to push and to challenge and to keep drawing us closer to Christ. And so I would encourage you, man, like, get plugged in, find a place where you can plug in, like Aaron said, and lead. The church needs you, and let's chase after Christ together. So honestly, I think this is a challenge for church leaders across the country. We've talked about it a lot in our church, right? That we don't want to just be this exclusive country club where you come and you retire, right? Like, that's it.
Gross.
Like, no. We want to be sincere and passionate about reaching people, like touching people's lives, pointing them toward the gospel of Christ. And I think churches like that are what young adults who are on fire in faith rally behind, like, because you want the same thing.
Right.
You want this true, authentic church where your faith can grow and can flourish. And so, I just want to say, young adults, next generation, like, we need you. If there's been a reason why you don't go to church, try it again. You don't stop going to a restaurant when you had one bad experience. Try it again. So, man, that's really kind of what I wanted to land on for this one. So I don't know if you have any closing thoughts.
No, man, I think that's great. I think, that's it. I'm not going to add anything to that. That's well said, bro. Well said.
Sweet. All right. Wrapping up today's episode with our creative corner. I'll let you go first since you've already planned yours out. Go for it. Who you got?
Bro. All right. Shout out to my guy, Taylor Lees. Taylor Lees. He, is kind of like a mentor to me. He is a creative videographer. He does a lot of work here around Austin and wherever he's needed. And he just got done. Well, he filmed this series a couple years ago, but it was just released because I think they were waiting on like the timing of things, and it had to do with the family and in need. And so they were waiting for things to clear with them. But he just posted this really cool video of, I'm not sure what the organization is, but I know this guy was trying to paddleboard like 100+ miles or 1,000 miles or something like that. And so he ended up doing it over the course of a couple of weeks, and he filmed the series on it, and it was a really dope story. They got to take out a family of this man who was hit by a drunk driver. They got to take him back out on the water after, I guess, years of not being able to do the thing he loved, which is surf or being out on the water. And it was a beautiful story and really, really well told by him and his craft of videography. And so shout out to Taylor, and go check out his stuff at, I think it's Lees Media or Taylor Lees on Instagram.
Yeah, check it out. Guess we can link it into the show notes. Real quick, I think when we're talking about this topic, there's one thing that comes to mind here that's semi-current that I think you should check out. There was a movie that came out called Jesus Revolution, about late 60s, early 70s movement, Jesus movement in California. Really well done piece. It's two Christian guys that have made Christian movies in the past, actually got funded by a major company, Lionsgate, to make this movie. Really well done movie. And so by now, I think it's probably gonna be on Amazon or whatever. Check it out. I think it just speaks to some of this like young adult awakening, arising, and there's so many similarities from the late 60s, early 70s to today that I think you would just get you would enjoy the movie, the film. And so
that's cool.
Take a couple hours, check it out. Really well done. Shout out to those. I can't remember their names. I probably should have looked it up, but Jesus Revolution movie, check it out. Pretty well done.
Jesus Revolution.
That's right.
All right. That's it, man.
That's it.
All right.
We will see you guys next time. Happy episode 10.
Yes, sir. Comment, subscribe, like, do all the things
all the things. Share it with a friend.
Yeah. We need help, please.
All right. Later, guys.
See you guys.